Hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of Cyber Warfare and Terrorism, a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. Thank you for joining us. My name is Guy Coward and I'll be your MC today, and your mentor is Richard Steenan. Before we begin, a few words on Zoom's webinar functions. We encourage audience participation during the webinar, and there are two ways to do so that we use. For questions, we ask that you direct all course content related questions to the Q&A section, and that you send all administration type questions to the support team in chat, and you can find both of those on the bottom of the Zoom window. For general comments or chat, you can choose to chat with panelists only or to all of your fellow students as well by toggling through the drop-down box once you have opened the chat log. If, as per last week, you're having an issue with chat notifications, this can often be resolved by changing the viewing size of the Zoom window. Sometimes it's an issue, sometimes it isn't, depending on the size. We've noted the annoyance that many of you registered last week, and we're sorry about that. And we'll follow up with Zoom, see if we can change our default settings, or just get rid of the function altogether. Given the enormous cohort, if we don't get to all questions, which is it's really likely that will happen, please feel free to ask your fellow students in the chat, as there are usually some very experienced industry-based students who will be most helpful. And we'll have a couple of Q&A sessions throughout the webinar today, at the end of which we'll clear all unanswered questions just for ease of use. Diane from IT Masters is here today again in a chat and technical support role, so thank you to her. She's also responsible for the learn.itmasters.edu.au website, the course page, which is where you find all the other materials needed for the course. Richard's extensive reading lists, which are really exciting this week, discussion forums, and the hurdle quizzes. If you have any questions today or later on about the materials, please feel free to contact us using the details on that page. Later, Jason Howarth of CSU will be along again, this time to talk in more detail about the Cybersecurity Masters in particular. But for now, here is Richard.
Thank you so much, Guy. So welcome back, everybody, especially the stalwart souls that are here for the second time to hear me talk. Just as a reminder, this short course is in 4 sessions. Last week we talked about cyber weapons. Today we're addressing Russian influence operations. Next week, as billed, we're going to talk about terrorists and cyber. And then the final week is military cyber preparedness. So how are military organizations around the world adapting to this new world of cyber warfare? But this week, we're going to explore information ops and hybrid warfare. You've probably seen in the news references to things like fake news, big lies, an old Soviet term, the big lie, they used to call it, trolls and bots. And really, I think I'm really identifying the soft underbelly of democracy and how weaponized social media has taken advantage of this looming vulnerability that we are now more than aware of. So I find it interesting as you dig into Russian influence ops that there's actually a body of academic research and proclamations and papers written by Russians about exactly what we're seeing happening today. This Igor Panarin is a Russian scholar, a professor who is kind of one of the thought leaders in the world of information warfare. So he talks about and identifies propaganda in its various flavors: black, gray, and white, intelligence, specifically information collection, analysis, so media monitoring and situation analysis, organization, which would be coordinating and steering channels and influencing media to shape the opinion of politicians and the mass media, and other combined channels. And then in terms of influence operations, he identifies information warfare vehicles such as social control, social maneuvering, information manipulation, disinformation, purposeful fabrication of information, i.e. fake news, And then maybe more traditional things out there like lobbying, blackmail, and extortion. And I suppose you could probably squeeze some of the more violent things into his thoughts as well. And if you are going to understand the world that Russia is attempting to create and their grand strategy, you should look no further than the Grissom of Doctrine. So this is an article that that he published in February of 2013. General Valery Grissom is Russia's chief of general staff, so he's the top dog in the military. And the title is rather innocuous. The value of science is in the foresight. But it really lays out a doctrine whose objective is to achieve an environment of permanent unrest and conflict within an enemy state. And so reading this document gives you this picture it's often confusing, right? Because most of us think of nation states as acting in their own best interests, cooperating when they can, competing economically, and then engaging in treaties in order to make things work better. And it's very strange to have what was once a great power engaging in just spread chaos everywhere, because whatever weakens the opposition or the West is going to be good for the aims or goals of the Russian state. So this fits in well with something I identified in my first book, and it's the path is there. And if you go all the way back to November of 2004, it was one of the first of the color revolutions. So in the Ukraine, it was called the Orange Revolution. In Ukraine, so we're talking, what is this, 13 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Ukraine held what were supposed to be fair and democratic elections. And UN observers and the populace felt that they weren't fair because the party that supported and was most closely aligned with Russia looked like they won the election. So the people came out in the streets by the hundreds of thousands, protested, and basically caused a new election to be held where the pro-democracy government was elected. So that was 2004. Obviously, the people inside government in Russia were watching that carefully. They had spent a lot of money on trying to win that election. It was essentially overturned because of their machinations, and it started to impact the way they treated future such elections and other engagements between Russia and former Soviet Union states. And one of the interesting developments was one of the things that an advisor to Putin did is he created this Naxi Movement. So somehow Naxi stands for Youth Democratic Anti-Fascist Movement Hours. So it was created in March of 2005 and was responsible. So if you think about it, a youth group of people aged 17 to 20 that numbered in the about 120,000 members, and they would engage in a summer camp every year. And of course, we start thinking about brown shirts, etc. whenever youth groups are created by governments. And these summer camps, as you can see from the picture there, just inculcated the children with the party line of Putin and kind of idolized Putin. It also had some nationalist and frankly, it had some fascist kind of characteristics to it. At one camp, there were 20 white tents set up, like the ones in this picture, that were meant for improving the demographics of Russia. In other words, these Russian children were supposed to, create more Russians in these white tents, which evidently that's exactly what they were engaged in doing. So fast forward a couple years, and you get the famous incidents that occurred around an Estonian effort to move the bronze soldier, the statue pictured here, and yeah, that's me a couple years later. And they basically, it was in a prominent position in a park downtown Tallinn, and they said, hey, you know what? We don't like the memory of the Soviet Union. We don't want to have this prominent statue downtown. It was erected during a visit by Khrushchev way back in the Soviet Union era. We don't like these memories. We're going to move it to a cemetery, a military cemetery on the outskirts of town. Well, that was the spark for street riots from the Russian-speaking population protesting this movement, and obviously supported by Russia in order to create this chaos. But don't forget that the Naxi movement had been created as a counter demonstration group of young men and women who were supposed to go out into the street whenever there was a democratic, which of course in this new speak, whenever you see Russian propaganda claiming something is fascist, it's actually democratic. And so they would go out in the streets and counter a riot if in the future there were any color wars going on. There hadn't been any color wars in the 2 years since they had been founded, so they focused a lot of attention on this. In Moscow itself, the Naxi protested in front of the Estonian ambassador's residence, jostled her rather roughly when she came out on the street. And because it was a group of young people, they were very well positioned to engage in denial of service attacks. We covered those last week. And back then, it was still the denial of service attacks I talked about then, using low-orbit ion cannon, getting people to refresh pages. But this one was a hybrid DDoS. So they attacked the networks, they attacked the websites of the president and the government. They DDoSed the fax machines of the parliament by sending so many faxes to it that they ran out of paper, and the phones of elected officials as well. And Estonia really, at the time, was highly networked. Just rolling out their e-government solutions. Everybody's got cell phones. Everybody was doing online banking with their phones, and all of a sudden they couldn't. So the banks, access to all the banks went down. The telephone systems, the network, the internet was all having trouble, and it took more than 3 days to get the network back up and running, and it took over a week to finally get back to stable ground. So that was kind of the, it's not like Russia sent tanks across the border. They did stop a few supply trains coming from St. Petersburg heading to Tallinn. But we really ended up having a wet cracker of a cyber war. But it was, let's stop and ask questions right now, because we're going to get to Georgia next.
Alrighty, we've got a question from Steve. What's the line between terrorism and warfare and lobbying and influencing?
Wait, say that one more time.
What's the line between terrorism and warfare? Is there a distinction between those two, and lobbying and influencing?
Oh my gosh, that's a good question. Well, I guess we're going to have, whenever we get to difficult questions like that, we fall back on norms. What's the accepted behavior, and yeah, lobbying and influencing, accepted behavior. Fake news and trying to take down networks, unacceptable behavior. But I'm sure that's completely open to interpretation.
And we've got just a couple more questions flying in, but we've also got some really interesting chat happening. A lot of talk about the difference between intel agencies and social media, like corporations versus states. There's a lot of, I don't know, questions about what we were talking about before, Richard, before the webinar, about sort of the ability of, I suppose, Western narrative to almost be a counter-offensive or even the offensive against which Russia is pushing back.
Yeah. There's definitely two sides to any war. And from I hope to take a historian's approach to current events, right? So yes, take in all the information, try and understand the motivations, and then compare it to your perception of the real world. And so, I tend to fall towards a realist in historic perspectives, but there are lots of other ways to look at the events, and especially, and of course, 5 years from now, we're going to look back at the events of the last 2 years and probably treat them differently than we are living in the moment. And it's certainly hard to pull all the threads and get them into a logical story, because we're still discovering things every single day in this particular quest.
Beauty. Yeah, let's move on.
Which we can continue. So we talked about this last week, but by many definitions, and especially mine, the first cyber war occurred in August of 2008. It was a cyber war only to the extent that these network-based attacks were used in conjunction with a kinetic war. So there was tanks and air battles going on as Russia moved into South Ossetia, so the breakaway region of the state of Georgia. And it was more effective than the attack on Estonia in that it supported an invasion, but it ultimately failed. The information war aspects failed. The world was against Russia's move. It was expertly timed. It occurred right during the Summer Olympics in China. You had the President of the United States and the President of China and the President of Russia all in the stands, while this other stuff was going off, in the background in the mountains. And they, from my readings, it looked like Russia took a long look at how that entire operation went. They ultimately didn't, get to overthrow the state of Georgia, though they've been successful in elections afterwards. So the president of Estonia at the time is no longer president, but they could have done better. So we'll get to their next steps in a second, but I wanted to start addressing this idea of influence operations, and one of the methods of doing that is paid commentators. So these armies of bots. So a couple days ago, Freedom House just published their report on internet freedom, but they devoted large sections to their analysis on governments engaging in social media influence. They say in these countries are credible reports that the government employs staff or pays contractors. So we know about the Tencent army in China. And not to leave the West out, it's not like everybody doesn't engage in this. Just a couple days ago, a researcher here in the United States discovered these massive buckets in Amazon S3 of, they say, they can't even count them because they can't download them all, but dozens of terabytes of captured social media records captured by the U.S. military. So this is outside the realm of the NSA, who probably doesn't store anything at all in Amazon buckets, but they had left them completely unprotected. And this researcher, Chris Vickery, was able to download big chunks of it so he could analyze it. He follows responsible disclosure, so he told the military about it before letting the rest of the world know about it, but he shared enough of it with news sources so they could examine it and figure out what was going on there. And in the early days when China especially was engaging in these comment armies, back then it wasn't social media as much as commenting on blog posts. And you've run into this wherever you go, right? You just visit some news article or a YouTube video, you say something nice or supportive of the content in it, and all of a sudden you're just ravished by these commenters who say all sorts of nasty things about you, and they're always anonymous, right? They're never traceable back to a real person. And that is become the state of the world as it is today. I'm sure every major government engages in this activity. But we've got a lot of good research on the Russian troll factory in St. Petersburg. There are now groups that are tracking their activity per day and watching how what they tweet about trends dramatically. And quite often it is both sides of an issue, right? So it's this philosophy of creating the chaos. So it's not trying to get a particular viewpoint across, is trying to get people angry and engaged in battling each other. And they might tweet a few million times, but the retweets and the uptake by the people that are feel themselves lined up with one side or the other is the real reflection capability of this kind of social influence. So let's walk through some of the targets identified to date of Russian influence operations. We're going to talk about Montenegro, Ukraine, Brexit, Catalonia. I guess Catalonia in passing. It's only recently that people have started to say, "Oh my gosh, the stuff in Catalonia fits the model," and there's now some evidence, but that could very well be just cognitive dissonance and people wanting it to fit. And of course, we're going to talk about the U.S. 2016 presidential election because it seems rather important. So Montenegro kind of slips by a lot of people's notice. But according to White House sources, there was a Russian plot to overthrow Montenegro's government by actually assassinating the prime minister. So this was a little over a year ago. And in the months before the coup was due to take place, the Kremlin is suspected of pouring millions of pounds into a slick pro-Russian election campaign run by the country's main opposition bloc, the Democratic Front. So here was a more overt influence campaign in a country much closer to Russia and their interests than the United States, for instance. But an example and a little bit of foreshadowing for what was to come in Ukraine. So there's lots of good research now on Russian influence operations in Ukraine in the reading list. We cite this testimony by Michael Carpenter, who's a professor and researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. But his preamble, he makes some pretty bold statements that Russia has used propaganda, sabotage, assassination, bribery, proxy fronts, false flag operations to supplement its considerable conventional force posture in eastern Ukraine, where several thousand Russian military intelligence advisors, unit commanders, and flag officers exercise command and control over the separatist force. Now, remember what I told you after the failed information war in Georgia. Compare that to what happened in Ukraine, where a lot of the same techniques were used, lots of misinformation, getting both sides essentially fighting in Maidan in the street. Somebody in there was there were snipers shooting into the crowd, and ultimately the president of Ukraine, who now he was the guy who lost the first time in the Orange Revolution. Now he was the president again, because that's how democracy works. He had to flee back into Russia. But at the same time, we had Russia engaging in these operations in Crimea, use the turmoil as an excuse to move in. It's probably one of the oldest excuses in the book. They asked us to come in, but it's one of the few times the UN, will allow you to invade a country, as if you're asked to invade the country. I think last week we talked about dark energy and its connection to sandworm. But this is where we move beyond information ops. We got into cyber warfare, a cyber attack on critical infrastructure, Christmas of 2015, and took out, I think it was up to 40% of the country's power, and centered around Kiev and Kiev's airport in a separate incident, totally without power. And all through this attack through a worm that had infected their SCADA control systems and given access to this, to the control panels. And of course, sandworm, even though attribution in all of this is difficult to do, but sandworm had been fairly positively attributed to Russian hackers in the past when they used sandworm to attack NATO operations and offices throughout Europe. So also in the past week, the cybersecurity chief of Britain has finally come out and starts warning about Russian hacking and in relation to Brexit. Those of us who have followed this, found this as no surprise. You got to read the Guardian article on Cambridge Analytica. It asks the question, did it influence the Brexit vote and the US election? So you dig into it and you find out that Cambridge Analytica is one of these modern, I'm thinking now to the question that was asked, so they're a corporation and they were set up in order to help other corporations do a better job of marketing. The idea would be that if they could pinpoint influencers and the key people that were susceptible to a particular message, then you could buy targeted ads. That was now made possible thanks to our friends at Google, Facebook, etc. And now you could have the ad for your product in front of the person who is most likely to click on it. So that's kind of it's on the cutting edge of where all this online advertising is taking us. Well, Cambridge Analytica was approached by the junta in Indonesia. We've got an election coming up. We'd like to hire you to help us better target our ads. Well, sure enough, the military junta won the democratic election in Indonesia. Same Cambridge Analytica has their fingers in the election in Kenya that was just overturned. Cambridge Analytica was approached by the two organizations, here we call them PACs in the United States, but it was two sanctioned funding organizations set up in order to vote for Brexit. So it was a for vote. Two of them were organizations. They both paid millions of dollars to Cambridge Analytica, who put over 1.6 million ads into Facebook. And ultimately, the argument now is being made that swung the vote in favor of Brexit. And of course, maybe this is connecting the dots too much, but for the Russian government to be interested, Putin in particular, to be interested in seeing the EU break up, just harps back to Cold War dynamics. And so evidently this happened. Now, in that time frame, right before the Brexit vote, Cambridge Analytica was acquired by a guy named Mercer, who is a United States billionaire, who is one of the biggest supporters of Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. And it was one of the biggest donators to their elections. And Cambridge Analytica also was involved in placing these ads on Facebook in the United States during the Trump elections. So let's talk about the U.S. presidential election. Just how bad is it? You know, is this as bad as it's starting to seem? So Twitter and Facebook were asked to appear before Congress last week. Twitter says that Russia generated approximately 1.4 million automated election-related tweets, which collectively received approximately 288 million impressions, a very large proportion of the U.S. population if those were all different people, but still a very, very large volume. They didn't count retweets in that. So these are people who would have seen it on their screen. Facebook is now saying, even though both of these said less than 6 months ago that we saw no signs at all of any of this going on. Now they're coming forward and saying, on deeper analysis, yeah, nearly 126 million people were exposed to content tied to Russia-linked accounts over a 2-year period. And then we learn, and maybe that's because not all of us are on Instagram, that Instagram is actually probably even more influential. An additional 20 million people may have been exposed to 120,000 Russia-backed posts on Instagram. So what are we talking about? These are some of the ads, paid ads that appeared on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. They're kind of ambivalent. You know, it's hard to really tell. Well, maybe that first one with Jesus.
That's something else.
That's pretty obvious. But you know, I saw plenty of ads like the one in the middle. You know, where Hillary asks, "What difference does it make? Follow veteran U.S. if you know the difference." I'm not quite sure what. Anyways, so really pulling at your heartstrings. You know, these are emotion-packed things that some of us were living through and you know, trying to unfollow our friends that were posting this kind of garbage. It was a very, very divisive and tumultuous election process. And then, of course, support for the concept that the borders are being overrun by people coming from Mexico. It just played on those. Somebody would pick it up and go with it and spread it and pay for them to be put in front of an audience that would pick it up and run with it. So it's very bad. On top of the pure social media influence, there's 32 separate voting registrar organizations that were being hacked by hackers that some are saying were from Russia. They weren't hacking them in order to change any votes, right? That's kind of hard to do because the U.S. doesn't have an electronic voting system. It'd be very difficult to do. But they were getting email names and addresses of people associated with the voting process, in sending them phishing attacks and trying to infect their computers, and you know, it was just kind of a broad swath of attacks going on. And of course, you had the successful penetration of the Democratic National Committee and Podesta's emails that turned into more of a political turmoil than anything else, right? It was the arguments over these emails that you know, led to the head of the FBI you know, making statements right at the end of the election that maybe swung the election. Who knows? We had these targeted attacks. Looks like a lot of them were you know, carefully tuned in order to influence people in the swing states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And at the end of the day, what started as this chaos campaign, you know, which, you know, there's evidence that most of the social attacks were in support of Bernie Sanders in order to you know, disrupt the Hillary Clinton campaign. But what started as that disrupt and confuse campaign turned into an unexpected win for Putin. There's supposedly intelligence from our friends at GCHQ that says that you know, the Kremlin was shocked at the outcome, shocked and elated. You know, it was like, what a score. They got Trump elected. So a little flashback. So this is February of 2016 at a info forum in Russia. So Andrei Khrushchev is a senior Kremlin advisor, and he made these comments, and he was addressing this audience, and he says, "You think we're living in 2016? No, we are living in 1948. And do you know why? Because in 1949, the Soviet Union had its first atomic bomb test." He's arguing that Truman would not have engaged in any sort of negotiation or paid any attention to the Soviet Union if they hadn't also developed an atomic bomb. So he goes on, "I'm warning you, we are at the verge of having something in the information arena which will allow us to talk to the Americans as equals." So he's comparing what now seems evident as the influence on the election. He's comparing that to having the atomic bomb. Putin has merely hacked democracy. He's took advantage of new vulnerabilities in the social system brought about by the internet. So democracy, if you think about it, has a very, very weak underbelly, and that's a voting populace. So if you can influence the voting populace, and this has always been a problem with democracies, and why Plato and Aristotle thought of all sorts of different methods of government, and that you want the people making your big decisions to be well informed and and educated and know both sides of an argument before they make a choice one way or the other. That doesn't happen, right? There are significant segments of the population that probably aren't, how to say this politically correctly, but probably aren't qualified to make the kinds of decisions they're being asked to make. Like, should the UK, get out of the EU? How do you make that decision? I wouldn't know how to vote in a vote like that. So, democracy has a fundamental problem, and the question I'm asking you, and hopefully we can address in the forums the rest of this week, is what are some ideas for how to fix this? Should we change democracies? Certainly, I think we should do something about plebiscites. Those seem to be very, very vulnerable to this kind of attack. Should we do something with our social media sites? Should we regulate them, or should they self-regulate? Build in controls, just like they've had to build in controls against spam and other types of scammy behavior, or else they just fall apart. You've got to have those eventually. So those are questions we want to ask, and we'll be debating for years to come. So I had one more. Okay, yeah. Questions?
Where to begin? If you could go back a couple slides just before I get to students' questions, or no, a couple more forward. Just the last one before your question, how to fix it.
Oh, okay, good.
One back.
All right, I'll get there.
Sorry.
There we go. Okay.
I think this is a fantastically interesting quote. And it sort of seems like, well, does the issue cut across whether or not it's democracy or not? You're sort of saying, well, a democracy is vulnerable because, I guess, of its openness and I guess the ability for it to be manipulated.
Yep. Which has always been the case, right? From day one, right? You get people saying things that are not true, and they
and
back and forth.
And I wonder whether you would perhaps categorize or characterize Russia as a little, like, despite it being ostensibly democratic in having a vote, perhaps more oligarchic, and I suppose they view maybe themselves as being under attack in which, or not having that equal foothold. So it just, I'm not even sure what sort of question I'm trying to ask, but it seems like it's not so much the political structure. It's just this massive free for all, a power battle. Like,
well, certainly we saw, and Russia had its own issues during its elections, right? And very, very suspicious results. I mean, first of all, Russia's elected the same person over and over since 2002, switching out between president and prime minister, but always being the one in charge. And second of all, in every working democracy, the winner wins by a few points, a few percentage points. So in Iran, when somebody wins by 94% of the vote, you got to be suspicious. In Russia, when somebody wins by 74% of the vote, you got to be suspicious. It's like the democracy isn't working if there's only one candidate that you're voting for. And Russia's got so much more going on internally. They're suffering economically. The great promise of post-Soviet Union hasn't come about for everybody, and it's got oligarchs, right? People have gotten fabulously wealthy from selling off state assets almost across the board, right? They were granted a franchise and made the most of it.
Yeah. Yeah, just a really interesting quote. All right, but we've got a heap of great questions. Jonathan has asked if you can perhaps outline Russian cyber activities in the Middle East, particularly Syria. Is it sort of within the scope of today, or has Russia played an instrumental role in the formation of the Syrian Electronic Army?
I've seen some connections, but not enough to draw a strong line. The Syrian hacker groups, feel more like the rest of the Middle East, where they're true grassroots hacker groups, because they engage in defacement and attacks against their true adversaries, which is understandable in all cases, right? Whether it's Pakistan, India, and right now Iran and Saudi Arabia, Israel and everybody around them. So I'm sure if we dig deep enough, we would find connections like that, but I'm not sure which way it would go.
Got a question about the level of corporate responsibility for Facebook and Twitter to control these influence and hackings. Do you think that the onus is on them, or something more, like you say, regulatory is needed?
Well, I think they could do so much and do it very, very quickly. For instance, know better who's purchasing ads, and not, it's just, there's a big difference between selling Ray-Ban sunglasses and buying an ad to put a meme up that's critical of a political party. And I think Facebook could make a decision to curtail that as much as possible. And they probably will right before Congress passes a law that requires them to do that. And that, unfortunately, Congress isn't going to think it out very well. And it'll whatever they come up with will be very expensive for Facebook to try and do.
Got a question from Links that might be a bit difficult to answer given it's so new. Could the current situation with the German government be the type of thing that Russia allegedly influenced?
There's been a lot of claims that that's exactly what's going on. So yeah, I think it is.
Okay, and then there's questions about is this focus on Russia because they're the best at it, or is it? Or are they a particularly malicious actor? I guess what's the takeaway there?
Yeah, so they I don't know if they're they're the best at it because they've had the most success at it. So it's been extremely effective. If you can truly, give credit to Russia for, impacting the election in the United States and Brexit, then they are hands down the best. It's Peter Singer said, "We're fighting with our hands tied behind our backs."
Yeah, it's a difficult position to fight from. I guess just a few comments left in the questions. We'll probably have to go to Jason fairly soon if you're about, Jason. One from Christoph that was sent in as a question, but I'll read it as a comment. Is not your perception of the real world determined by available information? How can one be unbiased? Like, we're all sort of approaching this from the perspective, and our gaze is sort of dictated to us. So there's a lot of comments like that coming through the questions.
Yeah, no, and that's completely valid to also always question your own biases. And that you'll notice if you think about your biases as you're formulating we're trying to get to the point where we understand the world around us, right? And it would certainly help to, talk to some Russians and find out what their approach to this is, as I have quite often. But I've talked to Russians on both sides of the debate as it is. So we have to make an attempt, and we have to recognize our bias. I like to think that I'm not biased in favor of the United States in this case, because I was certainly, aghast at the types of activity the NSA engages in around the world, as the entire world was. So, we saw in last week we talked about the types of espionage and information collection that the United States engages in. And they certainly engage in propaganda, right? As they fought the whole Cold War against the Soviet Union with the same weapons. They've still got Voice of America broadcasting into Eastern Europe, and it's, it doesn't feel like propaganda, but it probably is if you just tell your story in your words, even if you're being as truthful as you can. It's still propaganda because it's influencing. But do we want a world where a foreign nation influences our elections? Probably not. We want a world where a country led by oligarchs gets to invade its neighbors and take over them? Probably not. We didn't like it when Iraq did it. We don't like it when Russia does it. So go ahead, we don't like it when America does it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we don't like it when oligarchs take over our systems either.
That's right.
All right, I might have one final question then, just from Richard. How might Russia respond to this sort of info war targeted at them, sharing the love, so to speak? How does their doctrine relate to playing defense?
So they do, they do talk a lot about, their investments. There's just an article about Russia, funding and kicking up a big counter information warfare operation. So they do treat it as something that they have to be defensive on as well. And since I can't read Russian, it's going to be a long time before we see the Russian memes that the CIA is playing on Russian social networks. If they're there, that's the next story.
Yeah, interesting. All right, Richard. Well, thanks for answering a few of those questions. We might have to jump over to Jason. Are you about?
I am indeed. I am indeed.
Beauty. We'll get back to Richard at the end of Jason's presentation, everyone. We'll just have a quick sign off. Jason, I'll make you a
I'm
co-host.
going to share my screen now, and that should work.
Yep.
So we all good there? You can see my thinning hair.
Can see you in full glory.
Okay. Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Richard. Another fascinating presentation. So I just want to take no more than 10 minutes of your time. For those of you who didn't meet me last week, my name is Jason Howarth. I'm the Associate Head of School, Computing and Maths with Charles Sturt University. We have for a long time offered, in conjunction with IT Masters, a number of Masters courses that are very industry relevant and that often relate to the short courses that people are doing through IT Masters, in that those short courses are parts of subjects that are offered in our fully fledged Masters courses. So what I want to do today is just take you through a couple of those courses, one in particular, the Master of Cybersecurity, which is launching next year. But there's another one, it's kind of in a different school, but I want to mention it because it obviously is related to the area, called Cyber Studies and Investigations, and that's run through our policing school. So two different units I want to give you a quick overview of, for those of you who want to know more, who are thinking of moving on perhaps from a short course into university study. I might just, before I start, just ask people if they could complete the survey. The link is on the Moodle for this particular course, Richard's cyber warfare course, asking you to complete a pre-survey for a study that I'm doing around short courses and their ability to kind of influence people perhaps to move on to university as a consequence. So with that said, the Master of Cybersecurity is being released next year. It kicks off in 2018, January the 8th is the first session you can enroll, but there are multiple enrolment sessions. So there are 6 enrolment points into this course from next year. It's a 12-subject Masters. What that means is you can study part-time. It's designed for online students, and you can complete it at a fairly steady rate within 2 years of study. So it's very achievable within that 2 years of study, even if you're working, doing 1 or 2 subjects in a session. So in terms of the structure of the course itself, you can see there it's divided into what we call core subjects on the left and electives on the right. So core subjects, everyone must do those. So they're non-negotiable. Unless you get a credit for one of those subjects, all students in the Master of Cybersecurity have to do all 8 of those units. Then you've got the electives on the right, and you get to choose 4 of those electives. That's personal choice, depending on what suits your career direction or interest or whatever. So just looking down some of the core subjects, you can see there many of the titles are self-explanatory. We've got cybersecurity fundamentals. Typically these subjects run over what we call a session, which lasts around about 3 months. So it's a 3-month period in which you complete 1 or more subjects. A new subject we're releasing next year called Dark Web. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Cyber warfare and terrorism, and of course the short course that you're studying now is kind of a taster for that in terms of the content. Richard will also be taking that subject next year, and the short course that you're doing here also is kind of indicative of the technologies that are used in delivering these subjects. So your webinars, your learning management systems where you can read and post forum posts and communicate with other students. It's all part of the CSU official learning environment as well, although we do use a different learning management system.
Sorry, Jason, a question without notice.
Yep.
Just on that one. Next year, will there cyber warfare and terrorism, and for Richard as well, I guess, will that be a combination of this sort of social science as well as sort of the how-to and the more sort of technical elements to the course, or will that be something?
I might defer that one to Richard, given he's the man in charge.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely going to be more of the social science approach, and I'm a firm believer you got to understand the technology underneath. But I guess I can't reflect anything but my own education at King's. and take the academic approach. So it'll be an in-depth academic look at how people are writing about, thinking about, and responding to cyber warfare and cyber terrorism.
Yep.
Great, cool. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thanks, Richard. And I mean, the thing with these units as well is they complement each other. So, I mean, you don't want all of them to be the same, of course. And if you're looking at some are more theoretical, some are more practical. Digital forensics, ITC 597 there on the left-hand side, is a area where you're looking at digital crimes, but also forensic processes and procedures. And as part of your assessments, you're conducting simulated digital forensics investigation, including gathering evidence and being able to put together a case that might stand up in court. So all of these units complement each other in various ways. Hacking countermeasures is a subject that looks at hacking techniques and how they can be combated. So that unit looks at stuff like pen testing, social engineering, more traditional denial of service attacks and buffer overflows and cryptography, and how cryptography might be used in sort of nefarious ways. So there's a really good complement here of units that deal with practical and theoretical. Professional system security, you can see that one there on the left. That's based on the CISSP certification. So within that unit, you're looking at the 10 domains in the common body of knowledge. But as an aside, that actually puts you in a really good position then, once you finish that unit, to get ready for the CISSP exam. And conversely, what that means is if you do have the CISSP, if you are certified in that area, you can talk to us about possible credit in that subject. There's a really strong link here with industry certifications, and indeed industry presenters like Richard, which we use significantly within this program. It's not completely academic. There are, of course, academics more focused on research, but it's a really nice mix, I think. Down the bottom there in the core units, there's one there with an asterisk called Emerging Technologies in Information. In fact, I think that's a typo. I think it's called Innovation. Nonetheless, that unit is what we call a capstone unit. So that appears at the end of your degree, and that allows you to branch out on your own. So rather than us telling you, studying cyber warfare or digital forensics or hacking, you can decide on a topic that you want to investigate within that particular unit, and you can go for your life, investigate that particular area. It might be a cryptographic protocol. It might be some hacking technique. I'm not sure. I mean, it's up to you guys. But it does allow you to branch out and follow an area of interest within the security domain. So there is some scope there for tailoring. In terms of electives, you can see them on the right. You get your choice there, any 4, and they cover topics as diverse as how to respond to incidents, cryptographic protocols and procedures, risk management of IT, but also softer skills if you want to sort of add those into your degree. Things such as IT professionalism and ethics, which also teaches strong abstract reasoning as well, and professional communications. Obviously, a key area in any professional's arsenal is to be able to communicate effectively. So it's a really nice mix, but we have concentrated in the core on highly technical subjects with the ability for you guys to take some softer subjects within the electives. To have a bit of a look at one of these units, and obviously we don't have time to go super in depth, but students often ask, what do I do in these units? So if we take one such as hacking countermeasures, and that's running at the moment, and indeed if you enroll in early January next year, you'll probably be placed into this unit. Now, hacking countermeasures is all about scanning, testing, hacking secure computer systems, because you need to know how the other side works in order to defend. So some of the assessments, or in fact the current assessments that you will do as part of that unit, to give you an idea, in assessment 1 you'll be creating a password fetcher that must be concealed on a portable device, hopefully your own. I mean, we're certainly not asking people to do anything illegal here, but we're trying to teach the techniques that hackers might use. And you'll be writing a script to achieve that password fetching technique. That's assessment 1. Assessment 2, you'll be going out in the field using a laptop to perform wireless reconnaissance to find vulnerable access points. So perhaps a high density area, a supermarket or whatever, looking at vulnerable access points, then coming back to us with a report. We're of course not asking you to exploit those access points, but you can see that's part of the hands-on field work that you'll be doing as part of this particular unit. Assessment 3 is an investigation followed by an essay on some social engineering enterprise, some social engineering attack that was in the news. It could be recent, or it could be sort of Kevin Mitnick days perhaps, but the idea there is for you to realise that social engineering can be an incredibly powerful tool into systems, and we want you to investigate a case and present some findings for us. So that's assignment 3. Assignment 4 is in fact the exam. So most of our subjects have exams. They can be online or they can be paper-based. There is a mix. Increasingly, we're moving, I guess, to online, but there was also the option for paper-based. So the format of this year's exam is a certain number of multiple choice questions, a certain number of short answer questions, and some extended answer questions as part of that exam. An exam at CSU typically 2 hours long. That's pretty much how most of our subjects run in terms of a structure. Sometimes there's only 3 assessment items, two and 1 exam. Sometimes there's 4. And these are stretched out, remember, over around about a 3-month period. So in terms of who's taking hacking countermeasures and what that looks like, just as an example, we have a guy called Simon Jones. He's got over 20 years IT experience in specialising in areas such as network security, cryptography, access control, and security architecture. So he's a true practitioner. So it's great to be lectured by guys like this, as well as more academic individuals. But Simon takes this one. The content is in some sense based around the EC Council certified ethical hacker certification. So another, again, benefit of this particular unit, once you get through, you should be in a good position to move on then to that particular certification. You can see this is actually a screen dump from our learning management system. So once you enroll, you get access to this, exclusive access. It has all that you need to transact the subject, a list of your assessments, due dates. It has a facility for you to upload your assessments electronically. There's links to be able to access the weekly online webinars. So the kind of presentations that you're hearing from Richard are fairly standard across most of our units. So it's a really interactive way to gauge in online education. You can see down the bottom here, a little bit cut off the screen, but Simon also has a big index of weekly learning materials. So apart from the textbooks that you get as part of your enrollment, which we send you for free, and they're often e-books, but in some cases hard copy, you also get commentary on the various topics and the readings provided as part of this learning management system. What that means, I guess, is that you don't have to set foot on CSU territory. I mean, we love to see people from graduation, but this really is designed as an online course for working professionals. Another subject that we're introducing next year, it's fairly new, so I can't give deep details about the assessments. I can talk more about the topics, but it's dark web, obviously a very relevant area. So dark web is kicking off around about the middle of the year. It's a core subject in this particular unit. It's led by a lecturer who's got a lot of research publications on the dark web, and particularly on malware and malware detection. So he's a very well-regarded researcher in the area, particularly the area of malware. And some of the topics you'll be looking at within the dark web subject, analysing the threat landscape. Obviously, you're looking at the Tor browser and the Tor network. Also be looking at cyber criminals activities on the dark web, so the way they share information, perhaps through stenography or covert channels, but also looking at the monetization of cybercrime. So as part of that, you're also looking at money laundering, cryptocurrencies, all part of this unit. Extracting information from dark web blogs. There's a number of units there on dark web forensics, including forensic investigation models, and as well as you might expect, mitigation techniques. So we're not trying to produce people who cause problems, but who help to eradicate them. So all of these units, although they may take you down the path of the techniques that are being used, also feature one or more topics on, what can we do to stop this? So there are two units I wanted to tell you about. There are a lot of great ones in that particular masters. In terms of entry requirements, we might have touched on these last week. It's worth reiterating. In terms of the master's degree, in order to get direct access into the master's, you need a bachelor's degree or higher. And typically we're looking for people with some industry experience. Okay, we don't want someone who's never touched a computer before, having a bachelor's degree in nursing coming into this course. So we're also, in addition to your bachelor's degree, looking at experience levels. Now, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, but you have significant experience, and we might be looking at anything from 3+ years, depending on the level of experience, there is an entry into the masters from that graduate certificate. And that's just a subset of the masters. I'll show you that in a moment. There's no disadvantage at all in coming through that pathway. So if you're wondering about whether you're eligible, whether your experience level or your qualifications make you eligible for the course, you can go to the IT Masters site. They've got a wonderful thing called an eligibility form, which allows you to check whether you're eligible and also to check what credits you might be eligible for. You can also apply directly online, and that eligibility and credit check will also be done as part of the application process. So 2 URLs there to look at to be able to find out some more and potentially to enroll. I mentioned earlier about the graduate certificate pathway. So if you're coming in, you don't have a bachelor's degree, but you've got 5 or 6 years in a senior role in IT, maybe in security, we would let you into the masters by first of all giving you 4 subjects from the masters and kind of using that as a testing ground. If you get through that okay, you get awarded a graduate certificate, and from there it's just an internal transfer into the masters with all those 4 subjects given as credit, meaning there's 8 subjects left to do for the masters. I often say that's actually a better way to go, because at the end potentially you get to graduate with 2 awards, and even though they're related, one's a subset of another, it still looks good on the resume. You still got 2 awards. So there's absolutely no disadvantage in coming in through that pathway. Time commitment is obviously a big thing with professional working people with family and social commitments. So let's talk a little bit about this. As from next year, for the first time ever, we're offering 6 intake sessions for the IT Masters courses. So January, February, May, July, August, November, you can start in any of those periods. The next one that kicks off is the 8th of January. And for those of you wanting to do cybersecurity, you would almost certainly be put into the hacking countermeasures subject as part of that enrollment. But we also have another enrollment in February, late February, one in May. So it kind of depends on what suits you as well. In terms of the commitment, how much time is needed for this? It's always a difficult question to answer because people come from different backgrounds, they have different study habits, but we work on the rule of thumb that for every subject that you study, you need to allocate around about 10 hours of study time per week to do a good job of it. That's going to fluctuate up and down with experience, but it's a good rule of thumb. So if you're studying 2 subjects in a session, you're looking at around about 20 hours a week to do your study justice. You can vary your study loads. So a standard part-time enrollment typically is 2 subjects in a 3-month session, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with scaling that back to one subject. For really good students who have lots of bravado and think they can handle it, we can even scale up 3, 4 subjects. I mean, we need to be careful with that because it's quite easy to get people overloaded, but it is possible also to scale up and thus to reduce the length of your course. We also have what's called leaves of absence. So if you ring me up and say, Jason, look, I cannot possibly study over July. It's just not feasible. I have, business meetings overseas. I have family commitments. Then you can simply take a rest from study and reconnect or re-enroll the subsequent session. Your enrolment with CSU stays in place. No questions asked. You get to take that leave. And you get a certain number of those kind of without question. Obviously, if you're going to start taking dozens of them, then we're going to ask questions. But in terms of sort of taking 3 or 4 sessions of leave over the first 3 years of your course is not typically an issue. Okay, so there's a certain number of built-in leaves of absence. Credit is an area that people obviously are interested in because it cuts down both the cost and the duration of your course. So just to be aware, in a postgraduate course, a master's course, or a grad certificate course, we can only award credit for either previous postgraduate study or for industry certification. Okay, they're the 2 areas. We can't award it for work experience. Work experience is what helps get you into the program, but it's not something that we credit. So if you do have other postgraduate study in a similar area, but perhaps more relevantly, industry certifications, CISSP, for example, Certified Ethical Hacker, other industry certifications relevant to the area, we'll look at those. You may get credit. You can, once again, do a pre-credit assessment by completing the eligibility form at the IT Masters website. Also happy for you to contact me if you have any questions about credit, or Neil McCosh. I'll put our details up at the end of the presentation. So in terms of cost for next year, that's what it is per subject. Remember, there's 12 subjects in the course. So Australian and New Zealand students, Australian residents, $32.50 per subject. For international students, and I say they're distance or online because we don't have any on-campus students in these courses. For international students, $33.50 per subject. Textbook costs are included in those fees. There may be a small student services and amenities fee for each enrolment, for each subject, around about the $34 mark. There is also a chance you may be eligible for a loan to be able to defer those fees through the government fee help program, and always recommend that you talk to your accountant as well if you can claim any of this back, on work expenses, effectively educating yourself to be able to perform your job better. So it's always worthwhile doing that. And remember what we spoke about last week, face value, I mean, this is not a trivial purchase, but also think in terms of cost benefit. And we saw last week that the difference between not having a degree or having a degree over a lifetime of earnings can be millions of dollars. And that's from, the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Okay, so if someone's really keen and you're champing at the bit, you can actually apply now for next year. csu.edu.au/apply. As I mentioned, our intakes next year are listed there. Typically, it's nice to be able to apply 1 or 2 weeks before those intakes start. The earlier the better. You don't want to be kind of applying on the 7th of January for the 8th of January intake, because that's probably going to cause a delay with your materials. It's still possible, but the best thing is to get in early. That way we can get your materials to you early and you're not going to suffer any delays. It costs nothing to apply, free process. So, no harm done if you're vacillating, should I, shouldn't I, put in an application, see how you go. And don't forget that you're actually not due any fees until around about 3 weeks into your subject enrolment. So when the census date kicks in, if you decide to study and you do 1 or 2 weeks of a subject and say, look, this is not for me, you can pull out, no expense. Okay, the other course I wanted to mention, and this is not an IT Masters course, but it is an interesting one and obviously related to the areas we're talking about. It's a course run at CSU through our Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security, Master of Cyber Studies and Investigations. The target audience here is those who might be in law enforcement or in some kind of investigative role, and increasingly they're having to investigate digital crime. So their IT skills might not quite be as strong as their investigative experience, and that's kind of the recommended audience. You're going to be working in law enforcement or investigations within a company, and you're seeking to really boost up your IT skills in order to be able to carry out digital investigations. So many subjects are shared with our Master of Cybersecurity in this course. It looks a bit odd. The first one has 8 subjects, and it looks like there's only 6 there. But some of these subjects are what we call 16-point subjects, which effectively means it's a double subject. That's why there's not 8 units listed there. So in terms of some of the units there very quickly, investigations principles, you're looking less at technology and more at the whole investigations framework. So conducting interviews, taking statements, compiling a report or a brief of evidence, and finalising judicial proceedings. So the fundamentals of investigations, something that's going to hold up in court, something that's going to be sound. There are similar subjects on the same theme from both a multi-agency perspective. So you can imagine investigations which need to cut across many different organisational or agency boundaries. So local law enforcement working with federal police, working with some other company. So that really talks about that kind of sharing and multi-role investigation. And there's another one down the bottom there of the core subjects around transnational crime investigation. Obviously very important in a computer crime context where there often are no boundaries. So once again, you're looking at how to relate to other law enforcement bodies. Okay, local, federal, FBI, a transnational digital or crime investigation. And these units, many of these units are run by experienced UK police officers. So CSU has a fairly large component of UK police officers who lecture within our Australian Graduate School of Policing. So once again, you're getting practitioners lecturing this stuff. It's not just theoreticians. Okay, so if you do have any questions today about the various courses, the Master of Cybersecurity, please direct those to either me or to Neil McCosh. That's our area. You can phone, probably preferred contact is email. And if you do have any questions about the Master of Cyber Studies and Investigation, you can contact Brian Daly. He's based with the Policing Academy in Goulburn, and his phone and email is there on the screen. So thanks everyone for listening. Appreciate your time. Please remember to complete the pre-MOOC survey that's on the Moodle. Would appreciate that, and hope you continue to enjoy the cyber warfare course. So thank you to Guy.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you everyone for listening in. Richard, you're still there, I know.
Yeah.
What are we going to be talking about next week? And have you got any final comments, I guess, on today's very contested and super interesting
yeah, that was very helpful.
Presentation.
All the questions were extremely helpful, and I just posted. I added it as a comment. A master class that's coming up at the Australian or National Security University up in Canberra. That if anybody's in the area, they can see on December 5th. And then next week, we're going to delve into the intersection of cyber and terrorism.
Great, looking forward to that one. The forum posts are open, folks. So yeah, rip into it. It's tipping it's going to be another very interesting week in there. Other than that, thanks very much for Jason and for Diane for coming in and having a chat and working on the chat. Thank you all of you for taking your lunch break and perhaps a little bit longer. And then thank you, Richard. Have a lovely week, and we'll talk to you then.
All right. Thanks so much, Guy.
Thanks.